The GPS defaulted to the scenic route, the one that cuts through Millhaven before hitting the highway. I hadn't asked it to. My old address was probably still saved somewhere in the system from years ago, and some part of that machine remembered what I'd spent a long time trying not to. I turned down the volume on the radio instead of changing the route. Millhaven looks the same in October as it does in every other month. A little gray, a little quiet, the kind of town where the Dollar General is the newest building on Main Street and people still wave at cars they don't recognize. I'd grown up 3 miles outside of it, on a road that flooded every spring and dried into cracked red clay by August. I loved it the way you love something you have to leave to survive. The reason I was going back was my grandmother's 85th birthday. Not a party exactly, my stepmother doesn't throw parties so much as she orchestrates occasions. There would be a catered dinner at the house. There would be centerpieces. There would be a seating chart, which was her way of controlling who talked to whom and for how long. I found out about it 6 days before when my father texted me. Not called. Texted. Grandma Lorene's B-Day dinner Saturday. Hope you can make it. I stared at that message for a while before I typed back yes. My stepmother's name is Candace. She married my father when I was 11, 3 years after my mother passed away. She wasn't cruel in any obvious way. No one who met her would call her cruel. She was efficient, organized. She kept the house immaculate and remembered every birthday with a card, but she had a particular talent for making you feel like a problem she was managing rather than a person she was glad to see. By the time I left for college at 18, we had settled into a polite mutual tolerance. I called my father on Sundays. I came home for Christmas every other year. I didn't ask for more than that, and neither did she. What I had never told them, either of them, was what I did for work. That sounds more dramatic than it is. They knew I was a doctor. My father had come to my medical school graduation, sat in the bleachers in the August heat and shook my hand afterward, while Candace said she was proud of me in the specific way she said everything, like she was reading from a card she'd written herself. They knew I had done a residency. What they didn't know, because I hadn't told them and they hadn't asked with any real interest, was what came after. Families like mine, and by like mine I mean the kind where emotional information moves slowly and only when necessary, don't update each other in real time. My father knew I was a physician. Candace knew I had moved to the mid-Atlantic region. Neither of them had pressed for more, and I had let the silence do what silence does in families like ours, settle over everything like a fine layer of dust until you stop noticing it's there. I pulled into the driveway at 6:30. The house looked the same. The Bradford pear tree my mother planted before I was born had gotten bigger, the white blossoms long gone for the year. Candace had put mums on the front steps in a color she probably called harvest gold. My father met me at the door. He looked older than I expected, which is a thing that happens when you don't see someone for 2 years. He hugged me with one arm, the way he always did, and said, "Glad you could make it," like I had driven 20 minutes instead of 9 hours. "She's in the back," he said, meaning my grandmother, and I went to find her. My grandmother is the best person in my family by a significant margin. She is 85 years old and she still gardens and she still reads 3 books a week, and she has never once in my life made me feel like a burden. She grabbed my face with both hands when she saw me and said, "There she is," like I was something she had been expecting, like my arrival was inevitable and good. I sat with her for 20 minutes before anyone else tried to pull me into the general social mechanics of the evening. The dinner was in the dining room, which Candace had extended into the sunroom with a folding table and a tablecloth that almost matched. There were 12 of us, my father's brother and his wife, Candace's sister and her husband and their 2 teenage sons, who spent the whole meal on their phones. A couple from the church my grandmother attended, and Candace's friend Patrice, who I had met twice before and who had the specific energy of someone who is always performing for an audience only she can see. I was seated between one of the teenagers and Candace's sister, whose name was Becky, and who asked me within 4 minutes of sitting down what I was doing these days. "I'm a physician," I said. "Internal medicine." "Oh, still?" she said, like she was mildly surprised I hadn't moved on to something else. I said yes. I poured myself some water. Across the table, Patrice was telling a story about her son-in-law who had just been promoted at the bank. She told it the way people tell stories about other people's achievements when they want credit for being associated with them. Candace was nodding along with the attentive expression she wore when she wanted to seem engaged, while actually thinking about something else entirely. The evening moved in that slow, dutiful way of family dinners where no one is quite comfortable and everyone is pretending to be. My grandmother was happy, which was the point, and I kept reminding myself of that. She liked the flowers Candace had arranged, and she ate most of her food, and she laughed at something my uncle said that I didn't quite catch. That was enough. That was what I had come for. I was helping carry plates to the kitchen after the main course when I heard it. Candace and Patrice were in the kitchen already. They had lowered their voices, but not enough, the way people do when they want to be heard but want plausible deniability about having been loud. I stopped in the doorway. She moved all the way up there, and for what? Candace was saying. Some hospital job. She never talks about it, never says where she's working. I think she's embarrassed. Could be, Patrice said. She's been in medicine for, 7, 8 years now? And she rents. She doesn't own anything. I looked. A pause. She came back wearing that same coat she had in her residency. Some people just aren't ambitious, Patrice said, with the satisfied tone of someone confirming a theory. I don't like to say it, Candace said, which meant she very much did, but I think she peaked in medical school. You know how some people they get to a certain point and they stop pushing? I think she's one of those. I set the plates down on the counter with more care than I felt, and they both turned. Candace's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind her eyes. Patrice smiled at me with too many teeth. There you are, Candace said. We were just catching up. I said I heard, and then I picked up the dessert plates she pointed at and carried them back out to the dining room. I didn't say anything else about it that night. I sat through the birthday cake and the candles and my grandmother's wish, which she said out loud because she was 85 and had earned the right to say wishes out loud. And then I helped clean up and said my goodnights and drove to the Holiday Inn 12 minutes away because I had not been willing to stay in that house even before I heard what I heard. In the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone. I had a message from my hospital's chief of staff, a scheduling question, nothing urgent. I sent back a quick answer and then sat there in the specific quiet of a hotel room in a town you grew up in. I am not embarrassed about my life. That is the part I want to be clear about. I had not said what I did or where I worked because I had learned early in my career that people's behavior toward you changes when they find out, and I had decided years ago that I would rather be underestimated by people I saw twice a year than perform my credentials for approval I didn't need. I am a physician. I have worked in the same academic medical center for 4 years. I hold an appointment. I am a department director. I am not embarrassed. But I sat in that hotel room for a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning was the part Candace had organized as the real celebration, a Sunday brunch at the nicest restaurant in the county, which was a place called the Orchard House, 45 minutes outside Millhaven in what passed for a regional city. It had white tablecloths and a prix-fixe brunch menu and valet parking, which Candace had clearly researched and was quietly pleased about. My grandmother wanted me to ride with her, so I did. We sat in the back of my uncle's car, and she held my hand the way she used to when I was small, and she said, "How are you, really?" And I said, "Fine, really." And she looked at me with the eyes of a woman who has been watching people tell her they're fine for 85 years and knows exactly what fine means and what it doesn't. "She means well," my grandmother said. I squeezed her hand. "I know. She doesn't always." She stopped. Started again. "She loves your father." "I know that too," I said, and I did. That was the truth of it. Whatever Candace's failures were, that particular thing was not one of them. The Orchard House was prettier than its name suggested. Old stone exterior, ivy that had turned red in the October cold, a parking lot full of cars that cost more than most people in Millhaven made in a year. The host knew the reservation. We were seated at a large round table in a private dining room, the kind restaurants keep for exactly these occasions. The brunch was good. I ordered the smoked salmon and ate it slowly and watched my grandmother open a card from her church friends that made her cry a little and laugh harder. Candace sat at the opposite curve of the table and directed the morning like a stage production she'd been rehearsing for weeks, which, knowing Candace, she had. Near the end of the meal, when coffee had been served and my uncle was telling a story about a fishing trip, I stepped away from the table to use the restroom. The hallway between the private dining room and the main restaurant was quiet, lined with framed photographs of the property through different decades. I was looking at one from what appeared to be the 1940s when I heard my name. Or rather, I heard a voice I didn't recognize say the word doctor, and then a version of my last name. I turned. He was a tall man, somewhere around 60, gray at the temples, in a jacket that had the particular quality of something expensive worn casually. He was looking at me with the expression of someone who was trying to confirm they were seeing who they thought they were seeing. "Forgive me," he said. "I'm Owen Treadwell. I'm on the board at Whitmore." He said Whitmore the way people inside say the name of a place, without the full title, just the shorthand everyone who belongs there uses. "Whitmore Medical Center. My hospital. I saw you from the main room and I thought, you are Dr. Sinclair's, aren't you, internal medicine?" "I am," I said. His whole face changed, not surprise exactly, confirmation, and with it a kind of pleasure. "I thought so. We met at the Institutional Review Board dinner in February. You gave the response to the keynote." I remembered. "I did." "It was the best thing said that evening," he said, without inflation as a statement of record. "I have been telling people about the 38-year-old internist who made the entire room rethink their assumptions about longitudinal patient outcomes. You're at the top of your department now, aren't you?" "I heard the announcement in the spring department director as of July," I said. He shook my hand with both of his. "What are you doing in this part of the world?" "My grandmother's birthday." He smiled. "Wonderful. What a thing to have family." I agreed that it was. We spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. He asked one question about a paper my department had submitted to the journal, which I answered, and then he said he didn't want to keep me from my family and that he hoped to see me at the fall symposium, and he went back to his table in the main room. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went back to the private dining room. The table was mid-conversation when I returned. My uncle had finished his fishing story and someone had moved on to a piece of local news about a road-widening project. I sat back down next to my grandmother and poured myself more coffee. I don't know who saw me come in or how long it took for Candace to understand that something had happened in the hallway. I did not explain. I did not volunteer anything. But the restaurant is not large and the hallway is visible from approximately half the table through the glass partition, and at some point during the road-widening discussion, the conversation drifted, the way conversations do at family tables without any one person steering, to what I had been doing. My uncle asked, genuinely, how the job was going. "Well," I said. "She works at a hospital up north," Candace said, in a tone that meant this fact was the ceiling of what she believed was possible for me. An explanatory note, a footnote. "Whitmore Medical," my uncle said, looking at me. He said it the way someone says something they half know is significant. "Isn't that a teaching hospital?" I said. "Academic medical center." "Yes." My father looked up from his coffee. "She's the department director," said Owen Treadwell. He had come to the doorway. I hadn't heard him, with his wife beside him, en route to something else, stopping only because he had recognized the room and seen me through the glass and evidently decided that what he had to say was worth a detour. He said it simply. Not as a boast, not even as a compliment. Just as information, the way you correct a mistake on a form. "Internal medicine," he continued, looking at my father with the direct attention of a man who has run board meetings and doesn't waste eye contact. "She directs a department of 31 physicians. She's been published in the New England Journal twice in the last calendar year. We've been trying to get her onto 2 of our advisory committees, and she's very politely declined." He looked at me with something between reproach and respect. "I'll keep asking." The table was quiet. Candace had gone very still. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said to my grandmother with the easy grace of someone who has spent decades in rooms full of people he needed to charm. "Happy birthday. Your granddaughter is one of the finest physicians at any institution I'm affiliated with, and I'm affiliated with several." My grandmother said "I know" so simply and with such complete certainty that several people laughed. He said his goodbyes. His wife smiled at me warmly. They left. The silence that followed was the kind that a table full of people fills quickly to cover the fact that it existed, but it existed and everyone knew it existed, and for a moment before the noise came back in, there was nothing to hide behind. My uncle said something about Whitmore being a name he'd heard before. Becky asked how I'd gotten into such a role at my age. The teenagers briefly looked up from their phones. My father set down his coffee cup with a small, careful click against the saucer. I answered the questions that were questions and let the rest settle where it settled. I did not look at Candace. I didn't need to. I could see her in my peripheral vision, and what I could see was that she had rearranged her expression into something pleasant and was focusing very carefully on her coffee, which by then had to be cold. Later, after the brunch, after the slow process of getting my grandmother into her coat and finding everyone's cars in the valet lane and saying the goodbye that always takes 45 minutes longer than anyone plans, my father found me by my car. He didn't say much. My father is not a man who says much. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the red ivy on the side of the building, and then he looked at me. I didn't know, he said. I know, I said. A beat. The valet lane moved around us. I should have asked. I looked at him, at the particular face of a man who has never been good at this kind of thing and knows it, and is standing in a cold parking lot trying anyway. Yeah, I said. You should have. He nodded. He wasn't going to argue with that. We stood there for another moment, which is its own kind of conversation, the kind my father is better at than the other kind. She makes a good pot roast, he said finally, which is how he has always pivoted away from things that require more of him than he knows how to give, and which used to make me angry when I was young, and now just makes me feel the specific tenderness of loving someone for who they actually are instead of who you needed them to be. I know she does, I said. He hugged me properly this time, both arms, which he doesn't usually do. I let him. My grandmother found me before I got in the car. She took my face in her hands again, the same way as the night before, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, I always knew. I believed her. That's the thing about my grandmother. She doesn't say things to make you feel better. She says things because they're true. I drove back the same way I came in, through Millhaven, past the Dollar General and the Bradford pear trees and the road that floods every spring. The GPS didn't ask me to this time. I just went. I'm not sure what changed, and I'm not sure anything needed to. My father will call me on Sunday. Candace will send a card at Christmas with her signature. Neat, vertical, the C slightly larger than the rest. I will answer the call, and I will appreciate the card in the particular way you appreciate something that is what it is, and nothing more. But I think about that morning sometimes. Not the moment in the hallway. Not Mr. Treadwell at the doorway with his careful, factual words. It's not Candace's face going still. I think about my grandmother saying I always knew in a parking lot in October without a single note of performance in her voice. No audience. No point to make. Just a thing she knew and had always known and was finally saying out loud because it was true. That's the part I carry with me.